Hello and welcome. This is the launch event for Shadow State by the best-selling author and terrific Guardian journalist, Luke Harding. My name is Laura Hassan. I'm incredibly lucky to be Luke's editor at Faber. We're really thrilled that so many of you have been able to join us tonight. It's a lot more than we'd squeeze into a Dawn's, which is what we'd normally be doing on the eve of publication. And we really hope that you find this evening stimulating and riveting, and we're going to be talking about murder, mayhem, and Russia's remaking of the West, which is the subtitle of Shadow State. Just so you know what to expect, we're going to start with a reading from the book, and then Luke will be in conversation with Oliver Bullough. If you'd like to ask a question, there is a sort of questions section, so type in there and they'll go through to Oliver and he'll sort of read through them and put them to Luke later on if we have time. Just to give you a sort of brief summary of Shadow State itself before we have the reading. It's a gripping, really alarming investigative account of how Russia's spies helped elect Donald Trump, how they've backed Brexit, how they've murdered their enemies and threatened the very basis of democracy. It's published today and it's already garnering lots of praise. The critics say it reads like a thriller, that it's dazzling and meticulous. And it would be remiss of me not to tell you that it's available in all good bookshops, but I urge you to try and buy from the Guardian bookshop because it supports their journalism. So it was with real pleasure that I'm delighted to introduce our reader for the evening. MyAnna Buring is here this evening. She, as many of you will know, is she's known for her kind of extensive work in theatre, in film and in television, most recently as Dawn Sturgis in the Salisbury Poisonings on BBC One. I was actually lucky enough to see MyAnna on stage. She did a devastatingly powerful performance as Marina Litvinenko in Lucy Prebble's excellent adaptation of Luke's book, A Very Expensive Poison. So MyAnna, if you could take over.
Chapter 1, Visitors from Moscow. The two men who got on a flight from Moscow to London didn't look like assassins. They were dressed inconspicuously in jeans and fleece jackets. Their names were Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bashirov. At least, that is what their Russian passports said. Both were about 40. Neither seemed suspicious. Businessmen or tourists, maybe. The plane trundled down the icy runway. In Moscow, the temperature was cold and raw. It had fallen below -10 degrees Celsius, not unusual for early March. In Britain, it had been snowing. The pair had brought woolly hats, a couple of satchels. One of them contained a bottle of what looked like French perfume. In the event that they were stopped at UK customs, the Nina Ricci fragrance might be explained away as a gift, a gallant one, with Made in France on the box. Aeroflot SU-2588 touched down at Gatwick Airport. It was Friday, March 2nd, 2018, and mid-afternoon. The two Russians made their way to passport control. Bashirov had dark hair and a goatee. Petrov was clean-shaven, his hairline thinning as middle age set in. We can only guess their mood. If they were nervous, no official noticed. The British Security Service has a database of persons of interest, terrorists, criminals, fraudsters. Apparently, Petrov and Bashirov weren't on it. At immigration, their passports and visas were checked and they were nodded through. What the UK Border Force didn't know was that the visitors from Moscow were actually spies, ones working for a hostile foreign power. They were career officers with the Russian military intelligence, colonels even. Their real names were Anatoly Chepiga, Bashirov, and Alexander Mishkin, Petrov. Their service had created a fake identity and, helpfully, in the best traditions of Cold War spycraft, supplied them with real passports that supported their fictitious cover. Chepiga and Mishkin had come to London on a secret mission. They were there to murder someone. Probably this wasn't their first such assignment, known by the KGB as mokro delo, or wet work. Naturally, details of such activities are hard to come by, but travel records show a number of trips to Europe. This work had taken them to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Geneva. Their employer back in Moscow was the GRU, or Glavnoy Razveryvatelnoy Upravlenie. Full title: the Main Intelligence Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. The GRU is the most powerful and secretive of Russia's 3 spy agencies. It's military, under the command of the Defense Ministry and the General Staff. Back in the USSR, the army-led GRU and the spy-led KGB were often in conflict. Some of this rivalry spilled into the post-communist era of Boris Yeltsin and Putin. The GRU was in competition with the FSB, the KGB's domestic successor, which Putin headed before becoming prime minister in 1999 and then president, and with the SVR, Moscow's Foreign Intelligence Agency, the former KGB's first directorate, operating under diplomatic cover. The FSB handled security at home. It sniffed out and quashed opposition to the Kremlin, arresting students and political activists, locking up bloggers and protesters, and maintaining order. From time to time, it carried out foreign operations. Most took place in the near abroad, within neighboring former Soviet republics, which Moscow continued to view as part of its imperium. The GRU, by contrast, was global. It dealt with external threats. Its mandate was everywhere. The organization's activities ranged from traditional military deployments in war zones such as Syria to coups and invasions. Its officers saw themselves as part of a glorious tradition stretching back to Russia's battles against Napoleon in Crimea through to World War I and II, the latter the Great Patriotic War, as Russians call it, and the Soviet conflict in Afghanistan. Murder was something of a throwback to the GRU's 20th century heyday. The revolutionary state of Vladimir Lenin and its various successors had plenty of experience in political killings. Lenin, Stalin, even the ostensibly reformist regime of Khrushchev, had all sent agents to snuff out traitors. These deaths were seen as necessary to protect a noble and progressive state besieged by capitalist enemies and by nationalist ones. Moscow hunted down Ukrainian leaders abroad, including Stepan Bandera, killed in Munich in 1959 by a KGB assassin using a cyanide spray pistol hidden in a newspaper. In the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev ended such killings. It was a new age in which Russia and the West were friends. The next Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, confirmed and expanded this collaboration. Under Putin, however, murders stealthily resumed. Journalists, political critics, an ex-deputy prime minister turned irritant, all died in opaque ways. A former KGB officer himself, Putin, had a particular loathing for those who betrayed the fatherland. These people were scum. Traitors got what was coming to them, he said.
Thank you so much, MyAnna. We can't see our audience, but I think they're clapping in their homes. It was brilliant and it was so involving. Thank you so, so much. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair and our author. So Oliver Bullough is a brilliant journalist and author. His work appears regularly in The Guardian, in the New York Times and in GQ. He's the author of 2 non-fiction books about Russian history and politics, which makes him the perfect chair. The Last Man in Russia and Let Our Fame Be Great, as well as most recently his brilliant and eye-opening and Sunday Times best-selling book, Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back. Welcome, Oliver. And Luke, is he there? He is an award-winning foreign correspondent with The Guardian. He's #1 New York Times bestselling author. He has reported from all over the place: Delhi, Berlin, Moscow. He's covered many wars. He's been Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. I know Luke because of his books. He is a fantastic author of Mafia State, of WikiLeaks, The Liar, about Jonathan Aitken, Snowden Files, which is where we started working together, and Collusion. And I've had a great pleasure working with Luke over the last, I think it's 6 years now. He's worked on some of the biggest stories of the decade, and it's been an absolute thrill to be part of that as his publisher. whether it's the complexities of WikiLeaks, the labyrinthine kind of dirty dealing of Trump, or the madness of the kind of Snowden files. His talent is always to be incredibly forensic, to do the hard kind of investigative graft, and then what he does so brilliantly is turn it into page-turning, thrilling, fast-paced prose. Robert Saviano said that he is one of the best reporters in the world. Hurrah. So I would love for you two to discuss Shadow State. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I can't remember how many of Luke's books I've now chaired events for. I think this might be the third or the fourth. They come around astonishingly often, considering how much there is packed into them. I think it's one of the testaments to the sort of fast forward nature of history at the moment, that these books have just got such an amazing, volume of events and just stuff packed into them, and yet they come up so often. It's quite raw actually reliving this stuff, because it all feels so recent, and then seeing it in a book, it's somehow, they call it the first draft of history. It feels suddenly as historic as it really is, and it's an astonishing and kind of terrifying and horrible read, which is a recommendation, by the way. Normally when we've done events before, they've been at literary festivals and in the Guardian and various other places. So this is another sign of quite how historic these times are, that we're doing this one by screen because of what's going on around us at the moment. But the advantages of this is that you guys watching, of whom I hope there are some, otherwise, well, can ask questions as we go along. So please put questions in the question box, which you should be able to see, and I'll pick them out as we go along and ask them if they appear and they look interesting and they look opposite to what we're talking about. Luke, I was hoping that the Russia report would appear today, and then that would give us a real amazing news peg to talk about. But hey presto, the Russian report hasn't appeared today, just like it hasn't appeared every day for the last 9 months. Tell us a little bit about the Russia report, because it does seem a little bit germane to the topic of your book, because I mean, Dominic Raab did say it was going to appear shortly, but then Jacob Rees-Mogg said actually it wasn't. So, but it does seem a little bit germane. It's the subject of it, and we'd like to hear a little bit about what's in it perhaps, and also the fact that it hasn't been published is also kind of part of the whole story you're telling, right?
Oliver, thank you very much, and thank you, MyAnna, thank you, Laura. At the risk of being kind of, flippant in a Johnsonian way, here is the Russia report. I mean, in a way, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to try and explain, contextualize what was going on, and to not exactly sound the alarm, but just tell the story of Russian interference in British politics, and American politics, and European politics, and so on. I mean, the Russia report, I think, is now a bit of a scandal. I mean, the brief facts, we know that it was ready for publication in October of last year. Dominic Grieve, the then Tory MP, stood up in the House of Commons and said it should be out. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings basically sat on it. They sort of stuffed it into a sock, more or less. And I mean, I think that was wrong and problematic, because actually, wherever you stand on the Brexit conversation, whether you're left or right or centrist, it's important that that we understand that the scope, the extent of foreign interference in our politics, and particularly Russian interference. And one of the things I tried to kind of lay out is that what happened in America in 2016 with a kind of extensive multi-level spy operation to help Donald Trump win has been reasonably well excavated. I wouldn't say to the end, but we had the Mueller report last year, which confirmed sweeping and systematic Russian interference. And really the only person who kind of denies this happened is probably Donald Trump himself, who's in his own sort of delusional space. But in this country, by contrast, we haven't had Mueller. And one of the stories I reported out for The Guardian last week, citing the evidence to Parliament's Intelligence Security Committee of Christopher Steele, was that Johnson, who was Foreign Secretary in 2016, and Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, basically were told pretty bluntly that there was a likelihood that Donald Trump had been compromised by Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, and instead of asking the spy agencies to investigate, they threw a blanket over this. And I think when the Russia report comes out, I suspect it will be a little bit disappointing. I think people like you and me will pore over it and so on. But my understanding is it's pretty kind of discursive. But it points to the problem of our politics, the porousness of our politics. There are so many donors, Moscow-linked donors, who've given millions and millions, I'm not exaggerating, to the Conservative Party. One recently who's paid about £200,000 to play tennis with Boris Johnson, who's married to Vladimir Putin's former deputy economics minister. And so I tried to kind of explain what happened in 2016, but also to talk about the way in which Russian influence is, or Kremlin influence better, is sort of corroding our politics, our norms, and our values.
I think, I mean, obviously, as MyAnna was reading, there's a significant bit about the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, and which obviously is the most astonishing example of what you're talking about, of this brazen interference in the UK in the last few years. Obviously, before that was obviously the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, which was even more extraordinary. I think what I struggle to get my head around, reading your book and reading the Mueller report and reading everything, is what is in it? How can Vladimir Putin think it's worth taking these insane risks with his national security? What is he trying to achieve here? You know, no other country does this. You know, it does these brazen operations to undermine other countries or murder in this way. So what's he gaining from this? I think that's what I struggle with.
Well, I mean, I think what he's trying to do is, or what he is doing, is taking the kind of Soviet playbook that we saw throughout the Cold War of subversion and sabotage and trying to kind of wreck Western democracies, and he's kind of reusing it for our 21st century times, somewhat updated. And what's kind of interesting is if you go back to the Cold War, the KGB was hyperactive. It had agents that ran around the world. It funneled huge sums of money to Western communist parties in places like France and Italy and so on. It forged letters pretending to come from American racists and sent them to black diplomats in New York at the United Nations. It tried to stop Ronald Reagan from being elected. But actually, much of its operations, especially in Western countries, failed. And what Putin has done is taken this idea. I mean, he really viscerally regards the West as the enemy, and America as the main opponent, and the UK as a kind of junior main opponent. And he rather kind of inventively, he's updated this. So we saw in 2016, we saw these troll factories, cynical Russians sitting in St. Petersburg pretending to be Americans, and also Brits. The same people were tweeting in support of Leave, were tweeting in support of Donald Trump. So there was that. But you also get these extraordinary rogue moments of demonstrative, chilling murder and revenge. So you mentioned the Litvinenko story, which I wrote about in Very Expensive Poison, and also kind of Skripal recently. And I think what's interesting about the Skripal story is that there's sort of two messages from Skripal. One is clearly assigned to the British government and to MI6. It's a kind of up yours. It's a sort of V sign of contempt from Putin to the UK, which he especially loathes. But also, ultimately, I think the message of the Skripal-Novichok hit was directed at people inside the Russian elite, and in particular, inside spy agencies who are thinking about possibly cooperating with Western intelligence or talking to Robert Mueller about what happened in 2016 and so on. And it was this real, I mean, it's sort of, it's like something out of revenge tragedy, really kind of ghoulish message that if you defect, if you betray the motherland, then the long arm of Moscow will eventually find you and smash you in a kind of mighty blow. And it's quite a powerful message.
Yeah, about as powerful as it gets. And one thing I suppose after Litvinenko and Skripal, I suppose I'd started thinking that perhaps Britain was uniquely picked out, perhaps because of the weak response to Litvinenko, that maybe Putin thought we were kind of, fair game. You could just do what you liked in Britain. It didn't matter. I've been very troubled, therefore, by this extraordinary story coming out of Afghanistan in the last week or two about, the Russians supposedly paying bounties for the murder of American soldiers in Afghanistan. I mean, this does, it's starting to assume sort of serious rogue state dimensions, isn't it? I mean, you've called Russia a mafia state before in your book of that name. Do you think, I mean, is this going further than mafia state? Is this, I don't know what's more than mafia state, cartel state? I don't know, but anyway, where do you go next?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. I mean, I think rogue state is where we're at. Although I wasn't surprised by the story in Afghanistan. I mean, I didn't know about it until the New York Times broke it. But what's interesting, one of the things I try and write about in Shadow State, about the GRU killers, the work of Bellingcat, for example, in uncovering them. But until the Skripal hit, we didn't know that there was this top secret GRU diversionary unit operating in Europe, based in the French Alps, with these assassins mingling with Russian tourists in upmarket ski resorts and hanging out in Switzerland, being sent off to poison Bulgarian arms dealers, to try and kill Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, and we now know to pay the Taliban to murder American soldiers in Afghanistan and so on. And I think it's partly the GRU has always done this. I mean, it's as we know from my introduction, read by MyAnna, that they war is their thing. They don't believe in diplomacy; they believe in forced solutions. But I mean, I think it's also kind of remarkable that they got away with it. That we didn't know about these guys until kind of relatively recently. I mean, I compare the GRU to a sort of a lethal and dopey golem, like in Harry Potter almost. I mean, in a way, it's kind of funny, but it's not funny. I mean, you can laugh at the golem as it comes careening down your street until the golem extends its arm and smashes your house in, and then it's no longer amusing at all. But what I wanted to say was that I kind of more or less end the book with a quote from Vladimir Lenin, who described Moscow's relations vis-a-vis the West as a state of partial war, semi-war. And I think Putin really believes in that. He believes he's in a kind of unofficial war with the West and with America in particular, and that everything the GRU does is payback for the numerous crimes, as he sees it, the West has committed against the Soviet Union and Russia. And I would just say lastly that this vote or vote we had yesterday, constitutional referendum in Russia, which amazingly, Putin won.
It was a real cliffhanger. Yeah.
It was a real. I don't know if you've stayed up to watch the results, Oliver, like I did until the early hours. I mean, what that means is, well, it means that Putin will be going until his 80s in power. It means, I guess you and I will have gainful employment probably as Russia experts, although we may be morally exhausted by the end of it. But what it means is Salisbury, London, the Millennium Hotel, Ukraine, invasions of Ukraine, annexation, Georgia. This will continue. Unfortunately, there will be a further box set, and I don't know whether it will be the Baltic states that he has to go at, whether it'll be some further misadventure in the Middle East. But we can guarantee he'll be back to support Trump in 2020. But Putin is this kind of king of chaos, this sort of nihilist in chief, kind of global merchant of sabotage. That's what we're going to have to deal with, and what Western policymakers and politicians are going to have to deal with.
So this is one thing, I mean, going back to, I want to move on obviously, but going back to the Russia report, it's one thing I find very troubling is there are lots of people in the Tory party, Tory MPs, who know this, who appreciate the threat that Putin poses and appreciate the harm that he wishes us. And that being understood, why on earth haven't we got the report, right? I mean, this is what's so alarming about it, because it's, you know, is it's the threat that is posed is so clear and so obvious that what is it that's stopping the report from being published?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I did a kind of podcast for The Guardian, which I can sort of recommend for those of you who don't know. It's called Today in Focus, and they began it with me describing this party. In fact, Oliver, you and I were there as part of the kleptocracy tour just before the virus struck. In fact, I think you tweeted a photo of me in a blue woolly hat. It was the sort of last group event we did before we all got locked down, and we were standing in front of Yevgeny Lebedev's mansion. Actually belongs to Alexander Lebedev, a Russian oligarch, media tycoon, owner of the London Evening Standard, and of course former KGB agent. And the reason we went there was because the day after Boris Johnson won in December, he went to Lebedev's 60th birthday party. Curious thing to do, to go and pay homage to a KGB agent. And I'm not suggesting that Boris Johnson is a Russian asset. I'm suggesting that certainly the Kremlin has a kind of direct line to the top of Conservative Party decision making. Johnson, when he was Foreign Secretary, did this mysterious visit a couple of years ago in the spring to Lebedev's mansion in Italy, where he ditched his Foreign Office minders and spent the weekend there. This is just after Skripal had been poisoned and was snapped by a Guardian reader, completely disheveled and hungover, kind of flying back home again. I mean, this is very strange behavior, which he's yet to explain. And then we have, as we said, large sums of money coming from the from Russian donors to the Conservative Party, and then a political dynamic, which is, I think, the sort of Brexit situation, Johnson's pet project, means that firstly, he has to suppress anything which suggests that Donald Trump might be compromised, because you can just see Trump reading this and tweeting something about awful Brits, perfidious spying, etc. And also he wants a trade deal. He wants a US-UK trade deal, and he wants inward investments. And we all know, I mean, you and I have got many Russian friends, some of them watching this, you know, our kind of discussion. I mean, not all Russians are bad actors. I mean, most of them are wonderful. But there's a small cynical group of people around the Kremlin who are based in London and have spent huge amounts of money on. Well, they've bought newspapers, they've bought bookshops, they've bought all manner of things, and they employ accountants, lawyers, real estate guys, and so on. So I think, just lastly, so as I said, it's a shadow state. It is a book about kind of Kremlin corruption, absolutely, and malfeasance. But in a way, it's about us. It's about the corruption, unfortunately, in the UK and America, and the way in which Vladimir Putin is trying to push non-corrupt countries over the corrupt line to remake our countries in Moscow's kind of dark state image. And I think we're at a very precarious and rather terrifying moment.
One of the, you mentioned Eliot Higgins a little while ago. I was really pleased to see your big long read in The Guardian about him last week and read about him again in the book. He's a particularly singular being. Talk a bit about Eliot Higgins for people who don't know his extraordinary work, and also how he went toe to toe with the GRU and totally smashed them.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I really enjoyed writing that chapter, Oliver. It's called "Everything Is Open," and basically the thesis, which is, it's not kind of entirely original, but I would like to think that I kind of adumbrated in some way. Is that if you think about investigative journalists, you think about Woodward and Bernstein, you think about all the president's men, guys with sideburns, knocking on doors in 1970s California, you know, bringing down Richard Nixon, etc. And I sort of say, actually, kind of the new heroes of journalism are no longer Woodward and Bernstein. I mean, we're kind of, you and I, Oliver, like a kind of poor man's, you know, middle-aged, scruffy British Woodward and Bernstein, maybe, or at least in our heads we are. But actually, I'm afraid it's not us anymore. We need to move along. I write, you know, the new hero of journalism is a pacey-looking kid sitting in front of a laptop holding a skinny latte, and it's the age of the nerd. It's the age of the data cruncher, and it's the age of open source investigation. And what Eliot Higgins has done, for those who don't know him, he was himself a nerd, a kind of gamer, and a kind of weapons nerd. is he noticed that there was a proliferation of digital material out there, and that he began by winning an argument over whether a tank trundling down a road in Libya was actually, in the place he said it was, by using geolocation tools. And quickly he took this method and developed it into a kind of formidable investigative tool, done collaboratively, horizontally, with volunteers from all over the place. And what's interesting is that they really have. I mean, Bellingcat is from Piers Plowman, kind of medieval poem about you put a bell around the cat, and when the scary cat comes, you hear the bell. And I say the cat in its modern incarnation is the Kremlin. And my God, has Bellingcat dinged that cat's bell? I mean, they've exposed hundreds and possibly thousands of GRU agents, and they've done it through open source stuff, but also through partnering with great Russian journalists, and paradoxically by exploiting Russian corruption. That you can go into any market in Russia, you can buy a CD which has got a sort of national passport database on it, and you can buy records from the traffic police because they're so corrupt, and you can use these bulk indexes, and you can de-anonymize spies. And what's hilarious is that Alexander Yakovenko, the Russian ambassador, stood up and denounced Bellingcat, or Bellingcat as he called them, and sort of said that they're all spies working for MI6. Now, first of all, they're not spies for working for MI6, and I don't mean to diminish the work of the Secret Intelligence Service, but I suspect they are more effective. They're certainly fleeter, nimbler, quicker, younger, and they're exposing the fact that the GRU and the Kremlin are doing quite often these sort of analog plots in the digital environment, and it doesn't really work, as the famous interview between MyAnna was introducing us to Petrov and Bashirov, they gave to RT, where it's the most awkward, terrible encounter I've ever seen, where basically they're reading from Russian Wikipedia about the height of Salisbury Cathedral and said they were sightseeing, and while they're still a deadly golem, that they're also a ridiculous golem.
So you don't believe their cover story about being a couple who traveled around Europe selling sport supplements?
Well, I mean, I find it convincing for a couple of weeks, Oliver, but after more research, I concluded it's probably not true.
So a bit about, I've got to say, in terms of I mean, it's a great story the way you lay it out, the way that the Bellingcat team managed to, I mean, obviously it didn't take much sort of investigative nous to realize they were talking nonsense in their interview with Simonian. In fact, she seemed to also not really believe them while they were talking to her. But the way that Eliot Higgins was able to find out who they really were, pretty amazing, isn't it? Just do it. I mean, give the greatest hits of that investigation, because you lay it out so well.
Well, I mean, what they, yeah, I mean, they did, and all credit to them. I'm sure they'll win the Pulitzer for it. I mean, it was just the most dazzling investigation of last year. But essentially, they looked online and they did the obvious things, and it wasn't really working. And so they tried a deductive approach, which was to sort of say, look, these guys are about. They had the photos. So Theresa May had released the photos and the aliases of Petrov and Bashirov. Said, look, they look about 40. Where would a 40-year-old assassin GRU intelligence guy have trained? And they found a possible academy in the Russian Far East. And then they found a photo. And from the photo, that they had a possible name. And then they discovered that the name of this possible guy, that they were recipients of the top state order in Russia, and basically they kept going, and then they worked with an excellent outfit run by Roman Dobrokhotov, a Russian sort of independent site, who sent a reporter up to I think it was Petrov's home village in almost at the Arctic Circle, and they tried to find his granny. Granny wasn't at home. But Granny's friends and neighbors said, "Oh yeah, that's Mishkin. It's the right guy." And Granny is very proud because she has a photo of him shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. In other words, Putin had met these Salisbury killers and had given them an order and a state honor. we, we don't know for sure if Putin personally selected them for this operation, but what we do know about the sort of Soviet and Russian bureaucratic structure, and what we do know from the Litvinenko public inquiry, which you and I reported on in 2015, 2016, is that to do these kind of spectacular rogue operations needs Putin's approval. In other words, everything tells us that he is personally complicit in these murder operations. He personally authorizes them.
I mean, subsequently, thanks to the unfortunate transparency of quite a lot of Russian state information, because it just gets sold on CD-ROMs at traffic intersections, Bellingcat were then able to essentially reveal the passport details of a whole tranche of GRU agents. And so, I mean, we've seen, so with the Litvinenko operation, then the Skripal operation, and then this sort of farce of having their entire agent group blown. They're not very good at this, right? This is the GRU seem to be quite crap. I mean, so you got this sort of really scary combination of being ruthless and like incredibly dangerous and also crap. And so I find that again baffling. And I suppose the question is, do they care about getting caught or being found out? Is that part of the point? I can't get my head around it.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. And to try and answer that, I talked to Viktor Suvorov, who was himself a GRU intelligence officer. As far as I know, he's the only ex-GRU guy who will actually talk publicly. I mean, Skripal is in hiding; he's not accessible about his own whole organization. And I'd met him a couple of times and interviewed him at the end of 2018, and the 100th anniversary of the founding of the GRU by Lenin and Trotsky. And his thesis was that basically there was a kind of malaise which was affecting all of Russia, a kind of decay, a sort of almost a terminal illness is how he described it, which meant that it sort of blighted everything from rocket production to scholarship to university, to spying, that the assassins were just not very good at all. I mean, good anymore. And he complained of idiotism and said in his day they would have done it so much better. And there's certainly something in that. I mean, other people I've talked to who know GRU people confirm that. And one source was pointing out that if you cast your mind back to the Profumo scandal, which was recently dramatized on TV, and Ivanov, the GRU spy who slept with Christine Keeler, who slept with John Profumo, Ivanov was by all accounts good-looking, suave, multilingual, had these kind of Soviet posh manners, charming, debonair. I mean, someone you would be magnetically attracted to. And you go from that to Petrov and Bashirov, who are basically kids from the provinces with no opportunities, no education, no skills, no charm, no charisma. They're just sort of low-level thugs who can follow orders and are sent off on these astonishing kind of murder sprees. And clearly there has been a diminution. And just lastly on this, I mean, I remember from my time in Moscow when I was there as the Guardian's correspondent between 2007 and 2011, investigating Sasha Litvinenko's murder and talking to people not from the FSB, but who had contacts there, who were basically telling me as early as 2008, 2009, yeah, of course we did it. The FSB did it. And their only regret was not the murder, which was just terrible, but the unprofessional way in which it's done. And the quote I was told was, you know, in Yuri Andropov's time, we did these things much better.
We're not going to be able to get through the evening, I'm afraid, without talking about Mr. Trump. You obviously, quite a lot of your book features him and the curious events around his election, and then the Mueller report and the various extremely curious election events since his election. We've seen it again with this episode in Afghanistan, with the GRU hiring the Taliban to kill American soldiers, and Trump's failure to take any action or condemn Putin for this at all, which is just mind-bending. What's going on? Why does Trump have such a crush on Putin? You know, what's this all about?
Yeah, I mean, question is the word. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You look at Trump's benighted almost 4-year presidency, which has been characterized by chaos, dysfunction, braggadocio, a sort of diminishment of his vocabulary from 65 words to about 28 words, and the carousel of personnel going in and out, with John Bolton being the most sort of spectacular recent sort of flame out. And the one theme, the one constancy is Trump's fealty, obedience, obsequiousness to Putin, which I have a whole chapter about Helsinki. I mean, just looking at the events of Helsinki, when Trump, standing next to Putin in front of the world, basically rubbished the conclusion of all his intelligence agencies and said he believed Putin, when Putin said he had nothing to do with interfering in American politics. I mean, it was an astonishing treason. I mean, I'd say it was treason or treasony or treason-like or treason weaselish, some variation of the treason organogram. But it's kind of sort of pedestrian treason, because strangely enough, I mean, I haven't actually read John Bolton's, but I think, having read the reviews of it in the Post and the Times, something in my book where we agree is that Trump puts his own personal private interests above those of the state in which he's supposed to serve. It's always all about him. And I think on the Trump-Putin relationship, I really do think that was best explained by Christopher Steele in his dossier, which we saw, which BuzzFeed published in 2017. There's been huge pushback from the president and his allies about it, but I don't think it invalidates it. And while it's a raw intelligence document, I mean, it's not perfect. I think two key parts of it. One, that the Kremlin had definitely been cultivating Trump over a long period of time, at least 5 years, probably much longer. I mean, bear in mind his first visit, which I explore in Collusion, to Soviet Moscow was back in 1987. And secondly, the whole issue of compromising material. Now this wouldn't on its own explain Trump's behavior, but I think it co-contributes to it. And the allegation is that he was recorded in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 2013, you know, allegedly frolicking with 2 prostitutes. He denies that. But no serious person who knows Russia, who, like you and I, has worked there, or, you know, works for a Western intelligence agency. I talked to one former head of a major European intelligence agency, foreign intelligence agency, about this, and he said, look, yeah, of course, it's what they do naturally. They bug you. If you're Barack Obama, or if you're Trump, and you stay in a 5-star Moscow hotel, everything will be recorded. The KGB FSB technical team will be all over it. And you and I have done literary festivals together, and you know I've told these stories before, but in brief, when we were in Moscow, Phoebe and I, my wife, we too had break-ins at our apartment, and were politely advised by the British Embassy that our flat was bugged by the FSB, and there was bugging devices in our bedroom. So I mean, there will probably be a Luke Harding compromat tape somewhere in the Moscow vaults. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever see it, and I'm not sure how edifying it will be. But you know, there'll be an Oliver tape of some kind. I mean, you know, there's a vast repository of this compromising material. And just what I would say lastly is that, I mean, I had fun writing this chapter. I don't think Putin and Trump, when they sit in private and they've been their interpreters, and it's just the two of them, well, plus the Russian interpreter, I don't think Putin says, you know, Donald, do what I say, or we release the tape, or we talk about the money we gave you, or. I think it's just this primitive KGB 101 flattery. Donald, you are a visionary leader. We in Russia respect you. You are a great statesman, beset by opprobrious enemies and awful liberals, and I will be your rock. I will be your friend. I will be your blood brother, Donald. I will stand with you to the end. And this apparently works.
You have this line that you quote from Kipling, this, you know, we are of one blood, this sort of great spycraft line. You know, is that it as a sort of, you know, Donald sees, you know, Vladimir and says, this finally here's a guy who gets me. You know, do you think that's what this is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that. I mean, I hate to kind of, I don't want to put myself in Donald Trump's head. I mean, this kind of gloopish, inchoate swirl of nonsense and conspiracy. But I think the sort of substantial point is that he is a mark for every wily foreign despot out there. to manipulate and kind of exploit, and Putin obviously par excellence. But we also know from Carl Bernstein's report this week to CNN, where he's looking at the calls that Trump made to foreign leaders, and that, yeah, he's servile to Putin, but demeaning towards women, in particular Angela Merkel and Theresa May, who's just kind of very rude to, that Erdogan, the Turkish president, you know, would find out when he was free and would call him up and get him to do things like withdraw from Syria, from Kurdish Syria. And it seems anybody can reach him and mold his behavior. This is astonishing. It's unprecedented. I mean, it's a rolling national security nightmare. And we don't know for sure yet that it's over. I mean, there may be. When I started writing these books, and funnily enough, Stuart Kelly, who reviewed Shadow State for The Scotsman, described it as the third in a trilogy, very expensive Poison, Collusion, Shadow State. I hadn't really thought about it like that, but it's true. And also, you know, it was never meant to be a trilogy. I wanted to kind of stop, but you know, then Skripal happened and Trump happened, and you know, Russian power-assisted Brexit happened, and you know, I write to try and to capture, to explain, to contextualize, and just to pump true information into this dark, teeming place. Or at least that's my ambition.
I suppose, I mean, it's foolish to ask anyone to make predictions at the moment, but I suppose one thing that would stop you having to write a fourth book in your trilogy would be if people in power took notice of what you're saying, took notice of your reporting, and started actually erecting defenses against the kind of subversive infiltration of our society that we've been seeing. Do you get any sign that anyone is, you know, paying attention, or is it just you and me howling into a, you know, video call void?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, both of us sort of worked extensively on the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, and you've written a brilliant book on offshore moneyland, which I commend to everybody. But after the Panama Papers came out, 10.5 million secret documents, you know, expose all of these billionaire crooks, offshores, you know, geezers of corruption, and there was kind of huge outcry, and actually even the German police kind of, you know, kicked in a few bank doors and arrested a few bad chicken barons and things like that. And I was waiting to see what would happen in the UK, and nothing happened. I mean, there were cross-party attempts led by Margaret Hodge, the veteran Labour MP, to do something about our kind of overseas territories and try and you know, make things more transparent. There was one egregious case where a solicitor sitting in London had helped the daughters of the president of Azerbaijan buy a £50 million apartment next to Harrods, and where there's a little box where you're supposed to declare if your client is someone who's politically influential or connected. He didn't tick it, and about 2.5 years later, he was, you know, I went to a sort of tribunal, and he was kind of ticked off, and he got a kind of a mild fine of 10,000–20,000 pounds or something. And what I sort of write about the offshore world, I sort of say that it's a sort of, I compare it to a giant octopus with its tentacles wrapped around the globe, but I sort of say that London is its cephalopod head and brain, and it is, you know, we make this happen, and we do these investigations, and quite often they're complicated, and your pieces are always being legal and my pieces are being legal, and then we get threatening letters from oligarchs, and it's all a nightmare, and then finally we publish, and then we think this is the moment where something will change politically, and then you like my story on Twitter and I like your story on Twitter, and that's it. I mean, 6 months back, 1 like from Oliver. I mean, you know, I appreciate it, but I think now, especially with this government, they don't seem terribly interested in cleaning up Britain's act. On the contrary, their vision for Britain after Brexit is kind of like Monaco with bad weather and Weatherspoons. That seems to be it.
Monaco with Weatherspoons. That's brilliant. Put that on the posters. The Mueller report, I suppose, is kind of the Russia report that actually got published. It's a slightly alarming precedent, right? Since the Mueller report didn't really achieve anything either.
No, I mean, I describe it as a kind of historic miss, actually, in the book. I have a kind of late chapter on Mueller. I mean, I think he was sincere. I think he was hardworking, but ultimately he failed. And he failed because he was constrained by the Department of Justice. I think and by William Barr, Trump's kind of axeman, Attorney General. And he was constrained by his own kind of cautious bureaucratic approach. And if you read the Mueller report, it is a lot of kind of interviewing Americans and sifting through the electronic record. And what's completely lacking is the Kremlin dimension. I mean, there are indictments against the GRU hackers who siphoned off thousands of Democratic Party emails in 2016. And there's some granularity on that, but he never really followed the money. He didn't look at Trump's finances or tax returns or money flows. There didn't seem to be a counterintelligence component. And we didn't even get an interview, face-to-face interview with Donald Trump. And ultimately, I think it was very very disappointing. And another reason why, actually, I wrote the book, which was to kind of try and go beyond Mueller and to tell the Russian side of the story, because the American side has been pretty well turned over, but actually the sort of spies and hackers and shadow operatives who thread through this story, they're real people. I mean, they have families. The Salisbury assassins are both married with kids. They go to weddings. They have friends. I tell one story of a GRU hacker who traveled around the world, went to the Rio Olympics, and this is down to Bellingcat, not to me, but he spent so long on the road with these kind of macho GRU guys, he didn't have a girlfriend. And so he took out a dating advert at the age of 41, spy by day, lonely heart by night. And he came from this place called Murmansk, which is practically in the Arctic Pole, from some godforsaken Soviet nuclear submarine base. And again, it's astonishing trajectory of some of these people. I mean, another one, I don't know if we have time to talk about him, is Yevgeny Prigozhin. Shall I talk about Prigozhin?
Oh, yeah. Let's hear about him. He's amazing. Well,
Prigozhin, I write about him because Prigozhin, I mean, his story, I mean, I think we write non-fiction rather than fiction because actually non-fiction knocks fiction into a small cup. I mean, what's going on in the world at the moment is so grotesque and overblown, it's impossible to imagine. But Prigozhin was a Soviet hooligan in Leningrad who mugged a young woman, broke into people's apartments, stole tape recorders, got 8 years in Soviet juvie behind bars, came out at a time when everyone was stealing money, and was part of the kind of Leningrad underworld milieu. He began as a guy who sold Leningrad's first hot dogs. And then he moved up in the catering world, opened a restaurant where basically people from St. Petersburg's shadow government, sports guys, security guys, like to hang out. And one of his early clients was Vladimir Putin. And by the noughties, he's running elite restaurants. Putin turns up there, takes George Bush for dinner. Very soon he's getting billions of dollars in billions of rubles in Russian state contracts, cooking for the whole of Russia. Then he finances this shadowy mercenary group called Wagner, which has been active in Syria, in Ukraine, in the Central African Republic. And then he has a media empire, including a troll factory in St. Petersburg, which sabotages Western democracy in the US election. So he basically, it's like an 18th century novel, but bonkers. He goes from jailbird to kind of courtier to the Tsar to kind of billionaire with a yacht called St. Vitamin, a Cadillac, and he attends Security Council meetings in a suit surrounded by generals. I mean, it's awful and it's sinister and it's I mean, Gogol, come back.
I suppose the question is, though, and this goes to the heart of everything we've been talking about, when someone like him acts, is he acting on behalf of himself, or is he acting on behalf of the Russian state, or is the distinction essentially a meaningless one?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, Oliver. I mean, I think so what I write and what I think is that the boundaries between sort of private and state are blurred. In other words, what we have with Prigozhin is the state contracting out a strategic intelligence function, hack the American election, support Brexit, to a kind of outside player who makes money, has his own personal interests, is fantastically rich, but is doing kind of sovereign stuff. So it's this mixture between private gain and sort of state benefit, which is at the heart of the kind of modern Russian state. And after 2 decades of Putin, I think we have these two very stark projects. We've got the sort of nationalist project, which is noisy and ultra-conservative and orthodox with an O, and aggressive and revisionist to sort of make Russia great again, take Crimea, humiliate the West, and to sort of restore Russia's lost Soviet superpower status. And that takes up a huge amount of oxygen and public commentary and so on. But that's the front of the shop. And the back of the shop, Putin and the people around him stealing as much stuff as they can. I mean, they're all multi-billionaires. Putin is de jure, if not de facto, the richest person who ever lived, because he can command and instrumentalize the resources of all of the oligarchs around him, and indeed of the Russian state itself with its abundant natural resources. And so there's the nationalism, and there's the kleptocracy and the private stealing, and also, by the way, defending what you have stolen from predatory attack by others inside the elite who want to steal it from you. And of those two projects, the one that really keeps them up at night is the stealing part. I mean, Crimea ours, okay, that's great. You can shout those slogans. But actually, all of their money is in the West. It's been hidden by Swiss bankers, by clever city lawyers and accountants, by people you and I try and expose and write about and get threatening letters from, legal letters. And ultimately, I think the nationalism is there, it's genuine, but it's secondary to the theft and the kind of the mega kleptocracy.
Well, we've been speaking for an hour. I think that's a pretty good place to stop with the heartening thought that we now have Vladimir Putin in power until, what, 2036, if not beyond.
Well, Oliver, I wonder if you wanted to, I mean, don't want to hold our lovely audience, but are there any kind of, we could do one or possibly two very quick questions from the list if there are any? Because I don't know if
I got to say, it's possible that my screen isn't working, because if there are any questions, I can't see them, but I haven't used this system before, and I may be getting it all wrong. So I very much apologize to anyone if they have been sending in questions and I haven't seen them, because I can't, sadly, see any.
That's fine. We've done our time, and it's been a pleasure. And I'm not sure if it's just you and I watching, but if there are other people, thank you very much indeed.
Well, yeah, thanks to them for watching too. Laura's going to say a few things, I think, now, just at the end.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of you, to MyAnna for her beautiful reading, to Oliver for expert chairing, and Luke for just talking through Shadow State. It was such a fascinating and lively discussion. Thank you so, so much. And I hope to our audience who we can't actually see that it was a really rewarding evening for you as well. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, MyAnna. Thanks a lot.
Bye all.
Bye.